The silence stretched across the Nevada desert like a held breath, broken only by the distant rumble of jet engines cutting through the dawn sky. At Nelly's Air Force Base, inside a classified briefing room where shadows fell across maps marked with red zones and black sites, a conversation was taking place that would change everything. The woman sitting at the head of the polished oak table wasn't supposed to be there. According to every protocol, every regulation, every unwritten rule that governed the most elite military operations in the world, Zara Akaffer had no business in that room. But there she sat, her fingers drumming silently against the table's edge, her dark eyes scanning classified documents that most four-star generals would never see. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. 6 months ago, she'd been featured on the cover of Forbes, hailed as the youngest black woman to build a tech empire worth $8 billion. Her quantum computing algorithms had revolutionized everything from weather prediction to cryptocurrency mining. Wall Street called her the Oracle of Silicon Valley. The media painted her as the perfect success story, brilliant, beautiful, unstoppable. What they didn't know was that before the boardrooms and IPOs, before the penthouse offices and private jets, Zara Akaffer had been Captain Nightfall Akaffer, one of the most decorated fighter pilots in Air Force history. Her record was sealed, buried so deep in classified archives that even she sometimes wondered if those years had been real. The scars on her left shoulder said yes. The nightmares that still jolted her awake at 300 hours said yes. The way her hands instinctively moved to check 6 o'clock whenever she entered a room said yes. Now, as Admiral Harrison's weathered face studied her across the table, those two worlds were about to collide in ways that would test everything she thought she knew about duty, sacrifice, and the price of being exceptional in a world that demanded you choose between who you were and who you had to become. The manila folder in front of her bore a single stamp: Operation Blackout. Inside, satellite imagery showed something that shouldn't exist, a weapon that defied every law of physics she understood, wielded by an enemy that had just declared war on reality itself. The first question wasn't whether she would help. In her heart, Captain Nightfall had never really left the cockpit. The question was whether the world was ready for what happened when you gave a woman who had conquered both the skis and Silicon Valley a rifle that could reshape the battlefield forever. The answer, as the desert wind began to howl outside the reinforced windows, was about to unfold across 24 hours that would redefine modern warfare. Admiral Harrison cleared his throat and spoke the words that would pull Zara back into a world she tried to leave behind. "Ms. Akaffer, we need to talk about your service record." The weight of her past settled across her shoulders like the familiar embrace of a flight suit. She'd spent years building walls between Zara the billionaire and Captain Nightfall the pilot. In the next few minutes, those walls would crumble, and the woman who emerged would be something new entirely. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the Mojave, casting long shadows across the tarmac where experimental aircraft waited under camouflage netting. Somewhere in those shadows lay the answer to a question that had haunted defense contractors for decades. What happens when you build a weapon so advanced that conventional warfare becomes obsolete overnight? The manila folder crackled as Zara opened it, and her world shifted on its axis once again. The satellite images showed structures that seemed to bend light around themselves, vehicles that moved without visible propulsion, and in the center of it all, a rifle that glowed with an energy signature unlike anything in known physics. The enemy had found something, or built something, that changed the rules of engagement entirely. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded squadrons through combat zones where every second meant life or death. The transformation was already beginning, the tech mogul fatting as the warrior pilot rose to the surface like muscle memory. Admiral Harrison's answer came with the weight of inevitability. 6 hours until they deploy it against our forces in the Pacific. Our best projections show complete tactical superiority within 72 hours unless we can level the playing field. He paused, studying her face for any sign of hesitation. The weapon requires a specific neural interface pattern. Our scientists have run every test, every simulation. There's only one person on Earth whose brainwave patterns match the requirements. Zara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came before every dangerous mission, that moment when fear and excitement became indistinguishable. Her quantum algorithms had prepared her to think in probabilities and parallel calculations, but this felt different. This felt like destiny arriving disguised as coincidence. "What makes you think I'll say yes?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. Once a pilot, always a pilot. Once you've felt the rush of defending something bigger than yourself, corporate boardrooms lose their appeal. The Admiral slid a second folder across the table. Inside was a photograph that made her breath catch, her old squadron, taken 3 years ago during a classified mission over the South China Sea. Half those faces were gone now, lost to conflicts the public would never hear about. The other half were scattered across the globe, trying to live civilian lives while carrying secrets that made sleep elusive. "Because Captain Nightfall," Harrison said, using her old call sign with deliberate precision, "they're not just targeting our military assets. Intelligence suggests their first strike will be against tech infrastructure. Silicon Valley, your companies, your employees, the people who trusted you to protect the future you helped them build." The room fell silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the barely audible whisper of classified documents being shuffled. Through the reinforced windows, fighter jets traced contrails across the desert sky, and Zara found herself calculating intercept vectors and engagement distances without conscious thought. She closed her eyes and saw two futures branching before her like quantum states waiting to collapse into reality. In one, she remained Zara the billionaire, watching from her penthouse as the world burned around innovations she'd helped create. In the other, Captain Nightfall returned to a cockpit that had never really let her go, armed with technology that would either save everything or destroy it all. The decision had already been made before the Admiral finished speaking. It had been made 8 years ago when she'd first felt the G-forces press her into her ejection seat and knew she'd found her true calling. It had been made every time she'd woken from dreams of aerial combat and felt disappointed to find herself in silk pajamas instead of a flight suit. When she opened her eyes, Admiral Harrison was watching her with the patience of someone who had learned to read pilots' faces like weather patterns. He'd seen this transformation before, though perhaps never quite like this. "I'll need my old squadron," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had once coordinated strike packages across hostile airspace. "The ones still alive, still active, and I'll need complete operational autonomy once I'm in the field." "Done," Harrison replied without hesitation. "Your transport leaves in 2 hours. The weapon is waiting at a facility in Colorado. Our engineers have been working around the clock to understand it, but so far it's remained inert. According to our analysis, it's waiting for the right operator." Zara stood, feeling the familiar weight of command settling across her shoulders like an old flight jacket. Through the windows, the Nevada sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning shadows and revealing the stark beauty of a landscape that had witnessed countless military secrets unfold. As she reached for the door handle, Admiral Harrison's voice stopped her. "Captain, there's one more thing you should know. The weapon. Our preliminary tests suggest it doesn't just respond to neural patterns. It learns from them, adapts. Whatever you become when you pick up that rifle, you might not be the same person when you put it down." She turned back, studying his weathered face for any sign of deception or doubt. What she saw instead was the honest concern of a career military officer who had spent decades watching good people make impossible choices. "Admiral," she said, allowing herself a small smile that carried echoes of countless pre-dawn briefings, "I stopped being the same person the day I first strapped into a cockpit. Evolution isn't something that happens to pilots. It's something we choose every single mission. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like the end of one story and the beginning of another. The corridor beyond buzzed with purposeful activity as classified personnel moved between briefing rooms and communication centers. Nobody looked directly at her, but she felt the weight of recognition, the subtle shift in posture that indicated her presence had been noted and catalogued. Word traveled fast in military circles, especially when it involved someone whose very existence challenged assumptions about what warriors looked like. Her heels clicked against polished floors as she navigated hallways lined with portraits of military heroes, their faces frozen in moments of triumph and sacrifice. Soon, she realized, her own choices would either earn her a place among them or serve as a cautionary tale about what happened when civilians played at being soldiers. The transport waiting on the tarmac was a modified C-130, its exterior painted in the flat gray that screamed military priorities over aesthetics. The loadmaster, a weathered sergeant whose face suggested he'd seen everything at least twice, saluted with the crisp precision of someone who respected rank regardless of its packaging. "Ma'am, we'll have you in Colorado in 4 hours. The facility commander is expecting you." He paused, studying her civilian clothes and corporate bearing with barely concealed curiosity. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Granted, Sergeant." Most of the personnel at the facility have never worked with someone of your background. They're good people, but they might need some time to adjust. His tone carried the diplomatic caution of someone who had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of military life. Zara nodded, understanding the subtext. She was about to enter a world where her race, gender, and civilian status would all be scrutinized through lenses that had been grinding the same way for decades. The challenge wasn't just mastering an alien weapon. It was proving that a black woman billionaire could command respect in a context where both wealth and corporate success were often viewed with suspicion. "Sergeant, I appreciate the heads up, but I didn't get where I am by worrying about other people's adjustment periods." She settled into the webbed seating that would be her home for the next 4 hours. "Besides, I'm hoping the rifle will do most of the talking." As the C-130's engine spun up to takeoff power, she closed her eyes and began the mental preparation routine that had carried her through countless combat missions. First, she visualized the objective, not just the weapon itself, but the implications of what would happen if she succeeded or failed. Then came the tactical considerations, the variables that could shift between planning and execution. But underlying it all was a deeper current, something that had nothing to do with quantum algorithms or military protocols. She was returning to the only place she'd ever felt truly herself, where performance mattered more than perception and competence trumped everything else. The tech world had made her rich, but it had never made her complete. The aircraft lifted off with the controlled violence that she remembered from countless military flights, pressing her back into the uncomfortable seating with familiar force. Through the small porthole window, the Nevada desert fell away beneath them, giving way to mountain ranges that stretched toward Colorado and whatever waited for her there. Somewhere ahead lay a weapon that had defeated every attempt at analysis, a rifle that seemed to exist in defiance of known physics. Somewhere behind lay a corporate empire that had made her one of the most powerful people in America. Between them sat Captain Nightfall, preparing to discover whether some transformations could ever truly be undone. The steady drone of the engines provided a backdrop for memories she hadn't allowed herself to access in years. Her first solo flight, when the instructor's voice had faded from the radio and left her alone with the sky and the terrible, wonderful responsibility of keeping $1 million machine in the air through sheer skill and determination. Her first combat mission, when theoretical training had collided with the brutal reality of aerial warfare, and she discovered that fear and courage weren't opposites but dance partners. Her last mission, when everything had gone wrong and she'd learned that sometimes the hardest choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between two versions of right that couldn't coexist. The events that had led to her early retirement and transition to civilian life were still classified, but they'd left her with an understanding of warfare that extended far beyond tactics and technology. Now, as Colorado's mountains began to appear through the cloud cover, she wondered if the weapon waiting for her would demand the same kind of sacrifice. Innovation always came at a cost, whether in Silicon Valley boardrooms or classified military facilities. The question was whether she was prepared to pay whatever price the rifle demanded, and whether the world could handle the consequences of her choice. The loadmaster appeared beside her, checking his watch with the precision of someone whose entire career had been built on schedules measured in minutes and seconds. 20 minutes out, ma'am. The facility commander requested that I give you this. He handed her a tablet displaying a series of technical specifications and safety protocols. As she scrolled through the information, her breath caught. The weapon's energy output readings were beyond anything conventional physics could explain. The neural interface requirements seemed almost organic, as if the rifle had been designed to bond with its operator at a level that went beyond simple tool use. Most disturbing of all were the footnotes indicating that 3 previous test subjects had experienced what the reports clinically termed permanent cognitive restructuring. "Sergeant," she called, gesturing him back. "These test subjects, what happened to them?" His expression grew carefully neutral, the look of someone who had been briefed on operational security. "Above my clearance level, ma'am, but I can tell you that the facility has some of the best medical personnel in the military. Whatever happens, you'll be in good hands." The non-answer told her everything she needed to know. The weapon didn't just require a specific operator, it changed them, transformed them into something new. The question was whether that transformation would leave her more human or less, and whether the distinction would matter when the shooting started. As the C-130 began its descent toward the classified facility hidden among Colorado's peaks, Zara Akafer felt the last vestiges of her civilian identity falling away like shed skin. What emerged would be something unprecedented. A warrior shaped by both corporate boardrooms and military cockpits, armed with technology that existed at the intersection of science fiction and classified reality. The mountains below held their secrets close, their snow-covered peaks reflecting sunlight like signals from some vast communication network. Soon, she would join their ranks, another secret hidden in the high-altitude air where the horizon curved and the sky took on shades of blue that had no names. Whatever waited for her in that facility would test everything she thought she knew about herself, about warfare, about the price of being exceptional in a world that demanded impossible choices. But as the aircraft touched down on a runway that appeared on no public maps, Captain Nightfall was ready to pay that price. The question wasn't whether she would succeed. The question was what success would cost, and whether the woman who emerged from this mission would recognize the reflection looking back at her from the cockpit glass. Some transformations, she was beginning to understand, were not reversals but revelations, the uncovering of what had always been there, waiting for the right moment to take flight. The facility appeared through the aircraft's windows like something from a fever dream of military efficiency and scientific ambition. Set into a mountainside with the discretion of a government that had learned to hide its most dangerous experiments in plain sight, the complex sprawled across several acres of carefully camouflaged construction. Guard towers disguised as communication arrays monitored approaches that looked like hiking trails, but were actually kill zones designed by people who understood that the best security was invisible security. As the C-130 taxied toward a hangar that could accommodate aircraft 3 times its size, Zara caught glimpses of personnel moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who worked on projects that didn't officially exist. Their uniforms bore no unit patches, no identifying marks beyond the generic insignia that could mean anything or nothing depending on who was asking. The loadmaster appeared beside her again, this time carrying a duffel bag that clinked with the familiar weight of military equipment. "Ma'am, the facility commander thought you might want these." Inside, carefully wrapped in foam padding, lay a flight suit bearing the name tape Nightfall and wings that hadn't lost their shine despite years of storage. She ran her fingers across the fabric, feeling muscle memory respond to textures that had once been as familiar as her own skin. The suit had been tailored specifically for her, altered to accommodate the subtle differences in how women's bodies interfaced with military equipment. Someone had cared enough to get the details right, which told her more about the importance of this mission than any classified briefing. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'll change aboard if that's acceptable." The formality felt natural now, slipping back into military protocols with the ease of someone who had never really left them behind. The hangar doors opened to reveal a reception committee that looked like a cross between a scientific conference and a military tribunal. At the center stood a man whose bearing screamed career military despite his civilian clothes, tall, graying at the temples, with eyes that had seen enough classified operations to know when to speak and when to observe. "Ms. Acaffer, I'm Director Morrison. Welcome to Facility Dreamcatcher." His handshake carried the controlled strength of someone who had learned to calibrate his grip for both boardroom executives and combat veterans. "I trust the flight was satisfactory." "It was, Director. Though I'm curious about the name, Dreamcatcher seems oddly poetic for a military installation." She fell into step beside him as they moved deeper into the complex, nodding the subtle security measures that monitored their progress without seeming intrusive. Morrison's smile carried layers of meaning that would take weeks to fully decode. The weapon we're dealing with seems to operate on principles that exist somewhere between hard science and something that might have been called magic in previous centuries. Dreamcatcher seemed appropriate. They passed through security checkpoints that scanned everything from retinal patterns to quantum genetic markers, each stage adding another layer of clearance that moved her further from the civilian world and deeper into the realm of classified operations. The personnel they encountered nodded with the careful respect accorded to someone whose presence had been authorized at the highest levels. "Before we proceed to the weapon itself," Morrison continued as they entered an elevator that descended far deeper than the mountain's external appearance would suggest, "I need to brief you on what we've learned about its behavioral patterns." The elevator descended through solid rock that had been carved with precision that spoke of unlimited budgets and urgent timelines. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of amber and red, creating an atmosphere that felt more like descent into some technological underworld than movement through a government facility. "The rifle appears to be selective about its operators," Morrison explained, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to discuss impossible things with scientific detachment. "We've had specialists from every branch of the military attempt to interface with it. Special Forces, Marine Recon, Air Force test pilots, Navy SEALs, all of them highly qualified, all of them capable warriors. And none of them could make it work. Worse than that, the weapon actively rejected them. 3 experienced psychological trauma severe enough to require extended medical leave. 2 developed neurological symptoms that our best doctors can't explain. The 6th," he paused, studying her face for reactions. "The 6th is currently in a medically induced coma while we try to understand what the weapon did to his neural pathways." The elevator continued its descent, passing levels marked with designations that meant nothing to civilian eyes, but suggested depths of classification that went beyond top secret into realms where information became something approaching sacred knowledge. Zara found herself calculating the facility's depth and defensive capabilities with the automatic assessment of someone trained to think tactically. "Director, you're telling me that a weapon designed for human operation has hospitalized everyone who tried to use it, and yet you're confident that I'll be different. What makes you so sure?" Morrison's reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a man wrestling with the kind of decisions that kept senior officers awake at night. Honestly, we're not sure about anything, but our quantum analysis suggests that the weapon doesn't just respond to neural patterns. It responds to the mathematical structures underlying consciousness itself. Your work with quantum algorithms, combined with your military background, creates a cognitive profile that's unlike anything we've encountered. The elevator stopped with a soft chime that somehow managed to sound ominous despite its mundane nature. The doors opened onto a corridor that stretched into darkness, punctuated by pools of clinical lighting. The air carried the antiseptic smell of high-tech laboratories mixed with something else, ozone, perhaps, or the aftermath of energy discharges that push the boundaries of controlled experimentation. "The weapon is waiting in Laboratory 7, Morrison said, his voice dropping to the tone that military personnel used when approaching something that demanded respect bordering on reverence. "Before we proceed, I need to ask, are you prepared for the possibility that using this rifle might fundamentally change who you are?" Zara paused in the corridor, feeling the weight of the question settle around her like high-altitude air that demanded deeper breathing and clearer thinking. Through reinforced windows, she caught glimpses of laboratories where teams of scientists worked with equipment that seemed to bend light around itself, their faces illuminated by displays showing readouts that defied conventional physics. "Director, I've been changing who I am since the day I first sat in a cockpit. The question isn't whether I'm prepared for transformation, it's whether I'm prepared for the consequences of not trying." She resumed walking toward Laboratory 7, her footsteps echoing against walls that had been built to contain forces that conventional architecture was never meant to handle. Behind them, the elevator doors closed with a whisper that somehow sounded like a door closing on her previous life. Ahead lay a weapon that existed at the intersection of impossible science and military necessity, waiting to test whether a billionaire tech mogul could remember how to be a warrior when the fate of everything she'd built depended on it. The corridor ended at a door marked simply with the number 7, and a biometric scanner that required both retinal identification and palmprint verification. As the locks disengaged with a series of mechanical sounds that spoke of engineering tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, Zara felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. What lay beyond that door would either validate every risk she'd taken or destroy everything she'd worked to build. But as the heavy portal swung open to reveal the laboratory beyond, Captain Nightfall was ready to discover which version of the future awaited her touch. Laboratory 7 existed in a state of barely controlled chaos that spoke of experiments pushed beyond the boundaries of known science. Banks of monitoring equipment lined walls that seemed to curve slightly, as if the room itself had been shaped by forces that operated outside conventional geometry. In the center, suspended in a containment field that created subtle distortions in the air around it, hung the rifle that had defied every attempt at analysis. It was beautiful in the way that advanced weapons sometimes achieved beauty, not through ornamentation, but through the perfect marriage of form and function pushed to their absolute limits. The rifle's surface seemed to shift between metallic and organic textures, as if it couldn't decide whether it was manufactured or grown. Energy patterns flowed along its length in waves that reminded Zara of neural activity mapping, and when she looked directly at it, the weapon seemed to look back. "Jesus," she whispered, feeling a mixture of awe and professional appreciation that she hadn't experienced since her first encounter with experimental aircraft. "How long has it been active?" Dr. Elena Vasquez, the project's lead scientist, looked up from a bank of monitoring equipment with the slightly wild expression of someone who had been staring into the abyss of unknown physics for too long. "Active is a relative term. The weapon has maintained this energy state since we recovered it from the crash site 6 weeks ago, but it's never actually functioned, until now." As if responding to Zara's presence, the rifle's energy patterns intensified, cycling through frequencies that created harmonics in the laboratory's equipment. Monitors around the room began displaying readings that climbed into ranges marked with warnings about theoretical maximums and equipment limitations. "It knows you're here," Morrison said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to discuss impossible things with scientific detachment. "Every previous test subject caused some level of response, but nothing like this. The weapon appears to be anticipating something." Zara approached the containment field slowly, noting how her flight suit's integrated sensors began picking up energy signatures that registered as everything from radio waves to quantum fluctuations. The rifle grew brighter as she drew closer, its surface patterns shifting into configurations that suggested mathematical relationships too complex for conscious comprehension. "Dr. Vasquez, what do we know about its origin?" She kept her voice level professional, but part of her mind was already calculating engagement parameters and wondering what it would feel like to hold something that existed partially outside conventional reality. The crash site was in international waters, 1,200 miles southwest of Hawaii. Navy recovery teams found debris from what appeared to be an aircraft, but one built using principles we don't understand. This rifle was the only intact piece of technology we recovered. Vasquez's hands moved across control surfaces with the nervous energy of someone who had been working with equipment that challenged fundamental assumptions about how the universe operated. "The metallurgy alone defies analysis. The weapon appears to be constructed from materials that exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously multiple substances, until observation collapses them into whatever configuration is needed for the current function. It's as if someone built a tool that operates according to consciousness-dependent physics." Zara studied the containment field, noting the way it interfaced with the weapon without actually touching it. "How do we know it won't kill me the moment I pick it up?" Morrison and Vasquez exchanged glances that carried the weight of conversations held in rooms she hadn't been invited to. "We don't," Morrison admitted, "but our projections suggest that if we can't field a counter to the enemy's new weapons systems within the next 18 hours, the casualties from conventional engagement will be measured in millions rather than thousands." The mathematics of warfare, Zara realized, had shifted into equations where individual risk became acceptable when balanced against collective survival. She'd made similar calculations during her military service, but never with quite these stakes or this level of uncertainty about the variables involved. "I need to see the intelligence reports on enemy capabilities," she said, stepping closer to the containment field. "If I'm going to risk everything on an alien weapon, I want to understand exactly what we're facing." Vasquez activated a holographic display that filled the air above the laboratory's central table with tactical information that made Zara's breath catch. The enemy forces weren't just using advanced conventional weapons. They were deploying technology that seemed to bend fundamental physical laws. Aircraft that moved without apparent propulsion, ground forces protected by energy barriers that deflected everything from small arms fire to tactical nuclear weapons. "They're not just ahead of us technologically," Morrison explained as the display cycled through intelligence gathered at tremendous cost in human lives. "They're operating according to different rules entirely. Our best analysts believe they've achieved some form of consciousness-integrated technology that responds to thought as much as to mechanical input." Zara studied the tactical displays with the eye of someone who had spent years translating complex information into actionable intelligence. What she saw challenged every assumption she developed about modern warfare. The enemy wasn't just better equipped, they were fighting a fundamentally different kind of war, one where the distinction between operator and equipment had blurred beyond recognition. "So this rifle," she said, gesturing toward the weapon that continued to pulse with increasing intensity, "represents our attempt to fight fire with fire. Match consciousness-integrated technology with consciousness-integrated technology." "Exactly. but it requires an operator whose cognitive patterns can interface directly with quantum-level systems. Someone who thinks in mathematical structures complex enough to bridge the gap between human consciousness and post-conventional physics. Vasquez's voice carried the excitement of a scientist who had spent months working toward this moment. Dr. Vasquez, I need you to be completely honest with me. What happened to the test subjects who experienced neurological changes? What kind of changes are we talking about? The silence that followed stretched long enough for Zara to hear the subtle harmonics created by the weapon's energy field interacting with the laboratory's equipment. When Vasquez finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had watched colleagues pay prices that medical science was still struggling to understand. The changes varied, but they all involved alterations to neural pathway structures in regions associated with spatial reasoning and temporal perception. The subjects reported experiencing reality in ways that expanded beyond normal human parameters. Enhanced pattern recognition, the ability to perceive quantum probability states directly, awareness of potential futures branching from present decisions. They could see multiple timelines simultaneously. Something like that. But human consciousness wasn't designed to process that level of information. Two of them recovered enough to return to limited duty, but they needed extensive psychological support to filter the additional sensory input. The others. She gestured helplessly toward medical readouts that showed brain activity patterns unlike anything in neurological literature. Zara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded every dangerous decision, the moment when all the analysis and preparation condensed into a single choice that would define everything that followed. The rifle pulsed brighter, its energy patterns cycling through configurations that seemed almost eager. "Show me the containment release procedures," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made peace with necessary risks. "And clear the laboratory of non-essential personnel. If this weapon is going to bond with an operator, I want to give it every opportunity to do so without interference." Morrison nodded, understanding that they had reached the point where theoretical preparation gave way to practical implementation. "Dr. Vasquez, initiate Protocol 7. All monitoring equipment to remain active, but I want minimum personnel exposure until we understand the weapon's response patterns." As laboratory technicians began the careful process of powering down the containment field, Zara found herself thinking about transformation, not just her own, but humanity's. Warfare had always driven innovation, forcing species to evolve or perish. Now they stood at the threshold of something that might represent the next stage in that evolution, where the line between warrior and weapon dissolved into something unprecedented. The containment field flickered once, twice, then faded entirely, leaving the rifle suspended in the air by forces that seemed to originate from within the weapon itself. Energy patterns flowed along its surface like liquid mathematics, and when Zara extended her hand toward it, the weapon drifted closer with the eager response of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Her fingers closed around the grip with a sensation that went beyond physical touch. The rifle seemed to merge with her nervous system, sending cascades of information directly into her consciousness in ways that bypassed conventional sensory input. For a moment that stretched into subjective hours, she existed in a state of expanded awareness where past, present, and potential futures existed simultaneously. She was 8 years old, watching jets trace contrails across Georgia skis, and knowing with absolute certainty that she belonged up there among the clouds. She was 25, feeling G-forces press her into her ejection seat as enemy fighters closed on her 6 o'clock position. She was 32, standing in a boardroom and realizing that corporate success felt hollow compared to the clarity of aerial combat. And she was now holding a weapon that responded to her thoughts with the precision of neural interface technology that shouldn't exist for another century. The rifle had become an extension of her consciousness, amplifying her awareness, until she could perceive not just the laboratory around her, but the tactical situations unfolding thousands of miles away, where American forces struggled against impossible odds. "Captain," Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away, filtered through layers of expanded perception that made conventional communication feel crude and inefficient. "Are you all right?" She opened eyes she hadn't realized she'd closed, finding herself in a laboratory that looked subtly different than it had moments before. The equipment around her registered readings that climbed into ranges she instinctively understood despite having never encountered them before. The rifle in her hands pulsed with energy that felt like an extension of her own heartbeat. "I'm fine," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the weapon's energy field. "Better than fine. I can see the battlefield, Director. I can see what we're fighting, and I understand how to fight it." The transformation was complete, she realized. Captain Nightfall had returned, but enhanced beyond anything she had been before. The question now was whether the world was ready for what she had become, and whether the enemies advancing on American positions understood that the rules of engagement had just changed forever. Through the rifle's enhanced perception, she could see enemy forces moving with the confidence of technology that had never faced effective resistance. That confidence, she knew, was about to become their greatest vulnerability. The weapon in her hands didn't just level the playing field, it inverted it entirely. The tactical display screens around Laboratory 7 flickered and stabilized, showing real-time intelligence that flowed directly from the rifle's sensors into the facility's systems. What Zara saw through that enhanced awareness made her breath catch. Enemy forces weren't just advancing. They were converging on positions that would allow them to cut American supply lines and isolate forward operating bases within hours. "Director, I need immediate transport to the nearest combat zone," she said, feeling the weapon's energy patterns synchronize with her cardiovascular rhythm. "The rifle is showing me tactical opportunities that won't exist if we delay." Morrison studied the readouts with the expression of someone watching impossible things become routine through sheer repetition. "Captain, our nearest forces in contact are 1,800 miles from here. Even with priority transport, we're looking at minimum 4-hour deployment time." "No," Zara said, her enhanced awareness showing her possibilities that conventional thinking couldn't encompass. "The rifle can interface with our transportation systems. It's already mapping optimal routes and calculating deployment scenarios." She paused, feeling information flow through her consciousness like water through channels worn by countless years of erosion. "There's a prototype hypersonic transport at Edwards Air Force Base. The rifle says it can provide navigation assistance that will cut transit time to 45 minutes. Dr. Vasquez looked up from monitoring equipment that was recording energy signatures beyond anything in her experience. "Captain, the neural interface patterns we're detecting suggest that you're processing information at rates approaching quantum computational levels. Are you experiencing any disorientation or cognitive strain?" Zara considered the question carefully, nodding that her thought processes had indeed accelerated beyond normal human parameters. She could perceive multiple conversation threads simultaneously, track dozens of variables in real time, and maintain awareness of tactical situations occurring across vast distances. Yet rather than feeling overwhelmed, she felt more focused than ever before. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm experiencing enhanced clarity, not strain. It's as if the rifle has unlocked cognitive capabilities that were always there but never accessible through conventional neural pathways." She turned to Morrison, her enhanced perception already calculating the authorization levels needed to commandeer experimental aircraft. "Director, I need you to contact Edwards and prepare the Aurora prototype for immediate deployment." Morrison's expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and resignation, with the speed of someone accustomed to making decisions that balanced impossible requirements with available resources. "Captain, the Aurora is still in experimental status. We've had exactly 3 successful test flights, and none of them involved combat deployment. Then today will be educational for everyone involved, Zara replied, feeling the rifle's energy patterns pulse with what seemed almost like amusement. The weapon is providing me with flight parameters and system interfaces that suggest it was designed to work with technology we haven't officially developed yet. The implications hit Morrison with visible force. If the rifle could interface with experimental aircraft that exist,